Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good evening. We're talking about the autobiography of Malcom X. As I've said before, one of the most widely quoted, most widely read books of the 20th century, one of the most fascinating human beings of the 20th century to live. And talking about his book, we want tonight to make some of these things relevant that he's discussing in his book. First of all, he starts out chapter 15. We're discussing chapter 15. He starts out chapter 15 saying that he goes all over representing Elijah Muhammad, different radio stations, talk shows, TV shows, different places. He said the more places he goes to represent Elijah Muhammad and sharing the teaching of Elijah Muhammad, defending his teaching, the more letters he gets. He gets a lot of letters, especially from whites. He says about these letters he's getting from whites, that a lot of the whites agree with the analysis of Elijah Muhammad in terms of the crimes committed by against blacks here in the States and around the world. So they agree to that, but he said they don't agree to his solution, Elijah Muhammad's solution. So he talks about that. I think in this chapter, what we're going to see a slight departure from some of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad that he's going to share with us slightly in this chapter. At the very beginning, I think you see a slight departure. He talks about when he's sharing Elijah Muhammad teachings. Again, this is not true Islam, it's not my belief, it's not the belief of Muslims, and he's criticizing white people. He says a collective criticism. I think that's a slight part. He says not an individual criticism or individual white. He says collective criticism of the collective history of whites. I think that's a slight departure. But we see other slight departures that we go through this session. And then at the very beginning of the book, he talks about people consider him a racist or segregationist or reverse racist. And in the last chapter, I think this chapter makes a point of saying that there's a difference between segregation and separatism. He believes in separatism. He says segregation, I think this is more than the last chapter. He says segregation is like an exemplar of white supremacy, an exemplar of the slave system, where you have this superior power exercising control over inferior power. He said that separatism, when you have a divide among equals that decide to choose to divide. So he says a difference. He says that he talks about not being in favor of or in opposition to the freedom riders. Freedom riders are those, especially young people back then who lived in the northern part of the United States, northern cities, northern states, who would board buses and go down south and address issues that pertain to blacks, African Americans down south. He said he was against that. He said it's hypocritical. There's a very good Freedom Riders Museum in Selma, Alabama. You go to Selma, Alabama, you can see this Freedom Riders Museum. He says that that's hypocritical. He said that there are a lot of problems up north. He makes a point of this, too, I think is interesting. He says that the only time he would get coverage in the Southern media, Southern television station and press, he said when he's criticizing Northern whites, he said he get coverage there. It reminded me of the old adage, enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he said whenever he criticized the whites up north, the South, the Southern media would cover that. So he was critical of Northern whites, and they're hypocritical. They had these massive ghettos of North for all kinds of inequality, be there political inequality, economic inequality, medical inequality, education inequality. But he said, yet there was down South attempting to address issues down South, where they had all these inequality and all these issues up North. So he said, very hypocritical. Malcolm, in the first part of this chapter 15, he addressed what he sees as the major concern in terms of race. He says a concern of not necessarily civil rights, but a concern of human rights. And he sort of details what he's talking about. He says that as African American, that you can achieve in this society, you can get a PhD in this society, but yet you're seen as the same. You know, you drive to a certain area, you're gonna be stopped. This senator, I can't think of his name right now, U.S. senator, said twice he's been stopped profile driving a certain area where he lives. You know, so he said, Malcolm said, it's not what you achieve in society, whether you got a PhD or whatever. He said, they're never going to see you as the same. Your humanity will not be the same as their humanity, which to me, reminds me of the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, because Malcolm's saying here that the Black humanity, you know, they don't recognize your humanity, the humanity of Black people, you know, at all, or not the same as white humanity. He said, that's the problem, not having human rights in this country. You know, not seen as being human. He said, once you're seen as being human, then doors open. When you're not seen as being human, doors stay closed, regardless of what's done civilly in the society. You know, the white supremacy is just not, doesn't just pertain to civil structures in America, it pertains to cultural structures as well. If it only pertains to civil structures, you can pass laws that have significant improvements in America. You can't. We've had Emancipation Proclamation, we've had the Reconstruction Act, we've had the end of Jim Crowism, we have the end of the Black Codes, we had civil rights laws, we had voting rights laws, but a lot of these things that pertain to the race still linger because white supremacy is just not civil, it's culture, it's in the civil structure as well as the cultural structures of America. So it's not in the police department or the state house or the U.S. Congress or the school district or whatever, you know, school or judicial, is in the cultural structures as well as the civil structures. That's what Malcolm talking about. It pertains to human rights as opposed to just civil rights. Yeah. So he makes a point of that. I think it's a very good point. And then he talks about during this period of time, during the 1962, I think 62, 63 era time, he talks about this simmering, brewing, festering frustration among racial frustration among African Americans. This becomes like a powder keg about to explode. He talks about it. He said that it's not really organized. He says it's pretty organic. You know, a lot of lay people are involved in this, although he says that the Brotherhood of sleeping car porters are one of the groups that are involved in this initially, headed by A. Philip Randolph. Initially, sleeping car porters, these are African Americans who tend to care for whites on these passenger trains. Whites sleep in the best cars in the back of the passenger train, where blacks on these trains slept up front near the exhaust coming from the steam-driven engines. You know, so he said this group was involved in the very beginning, but basically it was organic. It dealt with lay people, just a festering, brewing frustration that had gotten very high pitch in American society, about to explode. American society among African Americans had become very combustible, you know. And but like I said, wasn't well organized. They wanted to march on Washington, make huge demand, wanted to change it. They said, according to Malcolm, he says that the blacks, African Americans, during this time period, were tired of the heel of a white man being on their necks. Does it remind you of anything? I think it does. This is historic stuff. Yeah. So he says that what happens, the White House get involved. The White House is afraid that if all these African Americans come to DC, there'll be a huge riot or turmoil or something in the streets there, you know, maybe something like what happened January 6th here just recently. So they get involved, White House gets involved to quell this. But international attention, you know, somehow is paid to this internationally. So when the White House found out that it's generating international attention, okay, they don't want to look bad internationally, so they give the green light. but they invite these leaders to the White House to try to quell things. During the same time, there's a philanthropist, a very wealthy philanthropist, who convenes the top 6 civil rights groups, the leaders, to New York. He convened them. He says that they have been squabbling over money, and they have been squabbling over money. So what he does to try to unite them, he offered them $800,000 to orchestrate this march on Washington. And he promised them more money will come later. So they drop all the differences, the squabbling and so forth. They work together, to orchestrate this march on Washington, become orchestrated from the top down. Whereas the concerns initially was grassroots concerns among lay people, not well organized, right? But they organized it from top down. And then you had white liberals getting involved, and you got white liberals getting involved, you got Black integrationists getting involved, and it becomes something totally different from what it was intended to be from the very beginning. It become like the place to be seen, Washington, D.C. for this march. Or, as Malcolm said, becomes like an integrationist picnic, you see. But lacking the real concerns that the lay people had. He said lay people were very militant, very militant. But when the so-called Big Six got involved, and the liberals and the integrationists, it became something totally different. He said it became so orchestrated that the people who came to Washington, D.C., the march on Washington, 1963, it was orchestrated and talked about. It was told when to come, where to come to, what to sing, when to leave, all of that was signs to have. In fact, it was told that they would be given signs, not a bringing signs. So it was totally controlled from the top. Malcolm thought this was, Malcolm talked about this. He called it a farce. He said it wasn't a march in Washington, it was a farce in Washington. Which really brings to the forefront some differences between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, because this march on Washington, and Malcolm refers to the farce on Washington, this is when Dr. King gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." Right? Beautiful speech. Malcolm, it was a farce. Malcolm said that it wasn't what it was intended to be. It was like it got hijacked almost. But it brings to the forefront some differences between the two, Dr. King on one hand and Malcolm X on the other hand. That movement to come out of the 50s and 60s was not called the Civil Rights Movement initially to begin with. It was called the Freedom Struggle. The Freedom Struggle became co-opted, became the Civil Rights Movement later on. But like anything, it had two sides to it. Everything come in twos, dual. You had Dr. King side, nonviolent side. Then you had Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, I said before, they brought in the Black consciousness in America. Said loud, "I'm Black and I'm proud." What time is it? It's nation building time. They brought in that attitude and that mindset in America. It was like the carrot and the stick. You drive a buggy with a carrot and a stick. So it's really the goal was the same thing almost. Because one of the things Malcolm does say early in this chapter, I think it is a slight departure from the teaching of Elijah Muhammad. He said what Blacks really want, to live in a free society, free and open society where they don't live by the stigma of being black skin, or the privileges of whites, the white privilege. He mentions that. So you have the two sides of basically the same thing, like the carrot and stick. And Malcolm crystallized this in 1964. He called it 1964 the year of the ballot or the bullet. Those are two sides. Malcolm's side, that he and Elijah Muhammad engendered in America, the consciousness they engendered in America, produced very militant organizations in America, like the Black Panthers Party. And like the group I belonged to, being when I was young, didn't know it better, the Republican of Africa. I mentioned last week how the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum gave me an award for some of my efforts work in this group when I was very young. But anyway, Malcolm's side, Malcolm Elijah Muhammad's side, generated these very militant groups. Black Panther Party in the mid-1960s, Republican of Africa, my group, my leaders, my group was all close associates of Malcolm X. The Black Guerrilla Army, a very militant group. So the ballot or the bullet, the carrot or the stick. But the goal was to drive things forward, for improvement, for the betterment of the plight of African Americans. So I'm saying the goal was the same, but there's two sides to that. Malcolm goes on in this chapter. He says that the New York Times says he's the second most sought after speaker in this country, college campuses and universities. Second most sought after. Malcolm said he speaks to over 50 different schools, universities, some of the top Ivy League schools in this country. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed debating and talking to different audiences. He said you can blindfold him. He can sit in an audience. He can tell you whether the audience is black or white. He said he could feel the temperament of an audience. He said he never talked about talking to a black audience and condemn whites for their crimes against blacks, African Americans, and you never had a black to defend a white. He said the only time he heard a black defend whites when it was in like a mixed audience. He talked about this particular time where there's this African American PhD and this predominantly white audience, and he was talking to them, and this black guy was giving him a hard time. He says to this black guy, he said, you know what they call a black person with a PhD? He said they call him the N-word. In other words, he said, your humanity to them is nothing, doesn't mean anything. Malcolm said that he will often debate these people who are head of departments, PhDs, graduate students, specialists in different fields at these different Ivy League schools and universities. He said he will start out telling them, he said, I have an 8th grade education from Macon, Michigan, I believe. He said, my high school diploma is from the Black Ghetto of Roxbury, Massachusetts. He said, I have a master's degree from prison. But they couldn't hold his water. He was very, very brilliant, very intelligent person. They couldn't hold his water. Although they were specialists, they had PhDs, they had heads of schools and departments and so forth, and grad students and so forth, So I think it's interesting how he would introduce himself, So Malcolm, he goes on, he talks about the global construct of white supremacy in this chapter. They had a global, not just a national, domestic construct, they had a global construct. He said evidence of this is how the Japanese was treated. He said during World War II, after that America was fighting Germany as well as Japan. He had people here in the United States that were of Japanese ethnicity as well as German ethnicity. The only ones rounded up in intern was the Japanese people, but they was fighting German people as well. They were not interned. They were not rounded up. So that was evidence of the global construct of white supremacy. I'm gonna just bring that a little further down the road. I remember being overseas at a school back in 2007 in LA. I walked down the street, walked to a very small neighborhood store, smaller than a 7-Eleven. I went in this store and shockingly what I saw, shelves of this was whitening or lightening cream, skin cream, to lighten the tones of your skin. Skin lightening cream. I saw this in a little small store in LA, in Abu Dhabi. I was shocked. I couldn't imagine going in the 7-Eleven and seeing anything like this. Whenever I went to the big stores over there, like Walmart's, the big stores over there, I would see the same thing, shells of the stuff. I've never seen this in a Walmart. So I was really, really surprised, So white supremacy always had a global construct to it. It degrades the fact of the human being, not just in the United States, not just in the Western world, but throughout the world, even in the Muslim countries of this world. as well. I had a very good friend of mine. I live here in Dallas area. He's a Pakistani descent. He told me that his sister, who had several degrees, said his sister had a hard time getting married because his skin was so dark. He's from Bangladesh. I remember being at a conference here in the States back in 2016. At a conference, a Muslim-run conference in 2016. At a session dealing with the racial issues at this particular conference in Baltimore, Maryland. And there's quoting Malcom X, quoting Martin Luther King. A lady who appeared to be a Pakistani lady, she gets up at this conference, wallahi, and she begins to hysterically, almost screaming and crying. She said, how dare you quote Dr. King? How dare you quote Malcolm? She said, at this conference, I just left a session doing matrimony. And they were asking people to choose for potential mates the color of a person's skin. What color do you prefer? That was in 2016 here in this country among Muslims. I can't imagine this among Christians. You see how white supremacy is a global construct and it degrades the faculties of human beings. Just want to make that point. When we talk about white supremacy, sometimes we think about it's just America, just Caucasian. No. That is not true. It's not true at all. So getting back to this chapter of the book, Malcolm talks about, he says that at one particular session at a university, he said there's a white lady that somehow he encounters. Then he says that when he gets back to New York City, he's at their restaurant, the Black Muslim restaurant. And that phrase, Black Muslim was coined by C.R. Lincoln, who was a Black professor at Spelman University in Atlanta, Georgia. Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm didn't like that phrase, Black Muslim, initially, but it stuck, but they did not like it. But anyway, Malcolm had somehow come across this lady on a college campus. He noticed that she was Southern somehow. And then sometime later, he saw this lady was in this Muslim restaurant in New York. She approached him. And she asked Malcolm, she said, have you ever seen or know of any good white people? And Malcolm looked at her and said, I observe deeds, not words. Deeds. So she asked, because he mentioned deeds. So she asked, well, what can I do? Malcolm looked at her and said, nothing. You can do nothing. So they ran out of the restaurant, crying, jumped in the taxi and left. So Malcolm talks about all this in the book. He talks about how Elijah Muhammad goes on Umrah. Elijah Muhammad goes on Umrah, he leaves Malcolm in charge. Often he would visit Elijah Muhammad in Phoenix, because he had moved to Phoenix and lived in Chicago. And Malcolm said Elijah Muhammad always treat him special way, almost like a son. But he says this, he said Elijah Muhammad doesn't like the fact that he's talking on all these different university campuses and college campuses. And he finds out later from some of Elijah Muhammad's sons why he doesn't care much for that. He said that one of his sons, probably Waqti Muhammad, tells him that he doesn't like that because he himself, Elijah, is not equipped to talk at the level. But he said he says that he loves Elijah Muhammad so that he would take a bullet for him. A lot of people during that day, they felt that way because they felt like Elijah Muhammad was almost like he's divine almost. And many people thought he would live, if not forever, he would live at least 1,000 years. Was it a cult? So toward the end of this chapter, Malcolm says this. He says that he was going to speak at Harvard. He has spoken at most of the Ivy League universities in this country, top universities in this country. This particular time he's going to Harvard. He goes in to speak at Harvard. There's a window there. He goes there, he can see out his window. And he said he sees the hideout that he had when he was a burglar, the gang hideout they had when he was a criminal. When he was living on the streets, when he was living, according to him, like an animal, would do anything to survive. Sell drugs, rob, steal, anything to survive. He can see their hideout right there, he said. His life had come full circle. He can see where he came from. He said he has a moment that, unlike any other time, he said a realization that Allah has, how Allah has saved him, Allah had pulled him up from the mud, had resurrected him, pulled him out of the mud. He gave credit to Allah. And I think that's the part. He didn't say anything about life. No, he said great credit to Allah and Islam for getting him out of the mud. He said, had he stayed in the mud in criminal life, and all this passed his mind while he was there to speak, looking out his window. Had he stayed in the criminal world, he said he'd been dead, still in prison, or old 37-year-old gangster waiting to get knocked off by a younger gangster. That's what he said. He ends this chapter talking about Icarus. Icarus in Greek mythology is a boy whose father fashioned him wings. These wings allow him to fly. But his father warns him, don't fly too high, because he wasn't flying on his own. But the boy thinks that he's flying on his own, according to his own ability. He soars up and up and up, higher than his father had warned him, and told him to stay on a certain level. He goes higher than that level. He goes so high that the sun melts his wings and he crashes back down to earth. Malcom says that he'll never forget. He'll always be thankful to God and never give credit to anyone else for pulling him out of the mud. But I think there's a lot of meaning to this, probably more than that. Maybe we can talk about this later. We want to conclude with that. We'll do also. regime, well, also in that son, if you also then the Dina Amino at the Salih, if you watch the walls, hawk, what the walls, so the so called so